Hello again. Welcome back for the sixth session of at ACI APAC Online. A good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the Middle East, Asia, and Asia Pacific. In fact, I think we have some colleagues joining from Europe. Last week, we celebrated those members achieving Green Airports recognition. We certainly look forward to celebrating in person next year. The session last week was also a very timely conversation among several airport CEOs on the subject shaping the recovery towards net zero carbon. We definitely appreciate their leadership, as they are also representatives on our ACI Asia Pacific Regional Board. The environment and the long-term carbon goals for our industry will stay in the forefront of many more conversations for the ACI community. In fact, as we briefly mentioned last week, in reflecting that climate change is a global challenge requiring an urgent global response, especially in the context of the IPCC's most recent call to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, ACI World has been conducting a wide-ranging study to determine long-term carbon goal at a world level for airports. ACI believes setting a goal will be a crucial component for the aviation industry's contribution to this global effort to address emissions. I understand the study is near completion and that an announcement is expected imminently from ACI World on its ambitious long-term carbon goal to support the decarbonization efforts of airports as they respond to climate challenge towards 2050. So do stay tuned. Today, we take a look on sustainability from a slightly different angle. Our world business partner, Arup, leads in a conversation on a sustainable paradigm for Asia's Greenfield airports. Moderating the session is Ian Taylor, who is Director, Aviation Advisory, and Global Aviation Business Leader of Arup. Ian, good morning to you in the UK. Thank you for joining us. I pass the time over to you to start the session.
So today we're going to have a conversation around the sustainable paradigm for Asia's Greenfield airports. Over the last decade, more than 100 Greenfield airports have been developed across the Asia region. And many more Greenfield airports will be built in the coming years. While COVID-19 pandemics led to an immediate collapse of traffic across the region and across the globe, in fact, the market fundamentals remain the same. And we believe that the Asia region will drive unprecedented demand for air travel in the future. And with existing airport systems already at or nearing capacity, major developments are necessary to serve these future demand. Of course, not all of the region's airports, Greenfield airports, will be large hubs, and in fact, countless regional airfield developments are proposed to bridge connectivity gaps that provide economic opportunity, equitable access across islands and the like, and challenging terrain and vast distances that are slow or challenging with surface access. While the number, scale, and role of Greenfield airports are open for debate, it's clear that Asia's Greenfield airports will play an important role in reducing global wealth inequality and improving the quality of life. However, as major infrastructure developments that will shape the environment, landscape, and communities for generations to come, this inevitably comes with an increasing responsibility to carefully manage sustainable outcomes, both positive and negative. So in this session today, we'll discuss what sustainability means for Asia's Greenfield airports with our panel, and try to understand where some of the levers sit to target good outcomes for all. The debate is played out in other parts of the world currently, and it's the conflict between the economic benefits from capacity development versus the environmental impacts. This is a sensible and appropriate conversation to be had in mature aviation markets, especially where there are already well-developed economies, good quality infrastructure, and viable ground transport options. However, in the developing economies throughout Asia, they deserve a more nuanced discussion, recognizing the unique role that Greenfield airports can play to uplift communities out of poverty, resolve connectivity gaps, and level the playing field on global competitiveness. Sustainability for airports is a broad, interconnected, and complicated topic, with each measure having a range of both positive and negative outcomes on the society and on planet. The sustainable footprint of any infrastructure asset is profound, but at the scale and role of greenfield airports, they're incredibly far-reaching. So we recognise that ecological and environmental issues, concerns and mitigations are major components of this, as demonstrated by last week's ACI session on the recovery towards net zero carbon. Airports, airlines and the whole aviation community must move forward on this journey together to decarbonise, minimise resources and tackle a host of environmental challenges. However, the focus of today's session is less focused on these aspects, which are vast topics in their own right, to instead discuss more broadly around sustainability, identify levers for better outcomes, and understand the role that we as the ACI community can play. The ACI community is already taking positive strides with the operational aspects, evidenced by year-on-year improvements in CSR reporting and adoption of programs such as airport carbon accreditation. But the sustainable touchpoints will differ throughout the airport's life cycle. For example, this diagram represents a range of desirable outcomes for an airport that can be best addressed at the concept, planning and design stages. Some of the greatest potential for sustainable outcomes are at these earlier decision points. And in Asia, the pace of development often means that these considerations are perhaps rushed and some of this potential may be lost. As the global community, it is in our collective responsibility and our interest to realise positive outcomes, and we need to work together to help influence and advise decision makers to make the right choices. Furthermore, the impacts of development stretch beyond the airport boundary fence into the surrounding regional communities. With a solid understanding of the local context, an airport can work with its partners to shape a long-term strategy for the economic development. For example, Arup recently worked with Heathrow Airport to develop their economic development vision and action plan for the third runway project. They set a clear vision to build on local strengths, address weaknesses, and enable local businesses and residents to benefit from the expansion. And it identified a detailed action plan with timelines to achieve its objectives. And this graphic, lifted from that report, demonstrates the extent of job creation that can be targeted by an airport development programme. So although this is UK specific in its context, it indicates the scale of the opportunity for all. So before we move to our panelists, I'm just going to touch very briefly on a sort of an example from Da Nang in Vietnam to set the scene. So Da Nang Airport, located on the eastern seacoast of central Vietnam, was upgraded in 2011. And although not a greenfield airport, it was a substantial transformation that unlocked successful tourism market, stretching from Da Nang city down to Hoi An. And passenger volumes jumped from around 3 million in 2011 to over 15 million in 2019, largely driven by tourism. And the direct, indirect, and induced positive impacts of the airport and tourism boom included job creation for construction, the service sector, and small businesses, providing opportunities for youth, which is vital in Vietnam, where 41% of the population is under 25. Tourism provides quality employment alternatives to factory work with better hours of wages. And GDP per capita, a good barometer of quality of life, accelerated sharply in Da Nang. Prior to the expansion, it was close to the national average, but by 2016, it was 40% higher than the national average. And some poorly utilised land has been converted to high-value real estate. One study found that optimally located land prices increased more than tenfold over the decade, creating upward mobility for villagers. But meanwhile, there were a number of undesirable impacts, such as lack of planning control leading to chaotic development of hotel resorts across the coastal strip, with some severe destabilisation of beach ecosystems and coastal erosion. Landowners have experienced growing wealth inequality with rising consumer prices and land acquisition costs. They're largely excluded from the opportunity of upward mobility. And serving the hours and seasons of tourism demand has meant longer working hours, and there's been some cultural impact from cancelling traditional festivals. So this demonstrates some of the extent of the influence that an airport development can have beyond its own boundary. So moving to our two panelists today, we're very lucky to have with us Daniel Bircher. Daniel is the CEO of Zurich Airport International Asia. He's accountable for Zurich Airport's regional office in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He was previously the Director of Operations at Bangalore International Airport in India and the Chief Operations Officer at Belo Horizonte Airport in Brazil. Under his leadership, Zurich has been awarded concessions for the Greenfield Noida Airport in India, which is currently being delivered in partnership with the Indian government. Our second panelist is Joanna Rowelle. Joanna is a fellow director of mine at Arup, where she leads the integrated city planning team, a group of urban designers, landscape architects, economists and planners. She leads a number of projects linked to economic development, funding and finance, master plans and strategic city plans and governance. She advises city governments on topics including infrastructure, investment, housing, finance, regeneration, and she leads Arup's global social value network. Joanna's authored reports on subjects including equalities, competitiveness and growth, and she's spoken at international conferences covering topics such as sustainable placemaking, aviation, economic development and regeneration. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panel for the conversation that I hope you'll find very interesting. So what I'd like to do now is to start a conversation on how the sustainability challenge and conversation can be broadened. So perhaps, Daniel, I could start with you with a question. With Zurich's experience in India, to what extent do you see airports shaping the sustainability landscape in terms of things like social and economic impacts and key environmental impacts?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian. Thanks for the invitation. I think if I look back, we at Zurich Airport, we started interacting in India 20 years ago and built the first Greenfield airport there. And I think environmental questions were there to a certain extent, mainly driven in the specific location there from scarcity of water. So that was an inherent motive there to make sure that we would have enough water for the whole development of the airport. Whereas today, if I see that, I think there is no question anymore whether an airport or we would do something or not, whether it's financially viable or not. I think it's a must. It's a paramount part of your business plan, and we as an airport operator also have clearly said that we want to start operating as a net zero emission airport in 2025. Now, this is what we strive for, and this is what we do our activities, do the planning, do the building of the airport. In the end, it's targeted towards this as one of the key strategic pillars.
Thanks, that's great. And I suppose that's sort of following on from that, as an investor, so what sort of lenses do you apply to sustainability in your own decision making for Greenfield airport investments in particular?
Well, the ESG requirements have changed a bit, and it has come up more and more as part of the requirements of lenders, of financial institutions, more from a reporting point of view. I think that would be the first step, that we broaden the reporting, include social governance aspects apart from the environmental. Environmental has been for the last 20 years, I would say, an important element for Zurich Airport, and it has been reflected in the reporting for a long time, but it was focused on purely environmental aspects. So that is going to be broadened, and what is also new is that investments outside the core market, in our case Switzerland, will be part of the whole reporting requirements. I think what we can say is that, and that's probably something to be improved on a global scale, is that for any kind of these new projects, environmental or ESG requirements are not yet a part of the selection process of bidders, are not yet part of the bidding parameters. At least we have not come across these things as decisive factors. I mean, they might have to be shown in some of your qualification criteria, but it's not that project developers are selected based on ESG strategies.
So that's interesting, I think, because I suppose what that could lead to is those of you that are based in markets or with investors that require you to report in that way, it could place you at a disadvantage if you're being judged against a standard which is different in certain markets. Is that something you're seeing, or are you seeing that all investors and all sort of inward investment is being judged by the same standard, even if the market into which you're entering isn't requesting that you report in that way?
I think it's very much there are regional differences. In some countries, this is much more strict than it is in others. But as a global, let's say, from a global perspective, it's not yet a decisive factor for development of airports. Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting, because I think, that's clearly one of the things that we want to investigate here and talk about is how the conversation is being broadened into benefits for the wider community, and that's part of it. But it's difficult to do if the people who are offering the concessions aren't necessarily seeing it through that lens themselves, I suppose. So maybe, Joanna, just turning to you to ask you a couple of questions. How far-reaching do you think the possible positive outcomes are for communities and their economies? And so what sort of positive, I don't want to use this word spin, but it's the one that comes first to mind, but what sort of positive angles are there that communities can see that ought to perhaps be considered by the people proposing the Greenfield airport developments?
Well, the obvious one is jobs and skills. And I think that there's been a lot of research and work undertaken over the last couple of years to identify and model the jobs and the skills that are delivered by airport development. And I think sometimes people have a bit of a misnomer about the types of jobs and indeed the skills levels that airports need for their employees. There's a whole raft of opportunities and deep and big supply chains that we see that are really active, and there are a number of airports that want to purchase locally, procure locally, make sure that local people are able to access jobs and employment. And in the UK, we've seen a real drive to make sure that those employment opportunities are through the entire skills chain. And there are really interesting processes going on with partnerships with further and higher education colleges to upskill people so that they get decent wages and decent lifetime opportunities. And we've certainly seen that with airport operators in the UK and Europe, looking at the way in which they can help to achieve the best standards and quality of life for people who live near airports. But actually there's been work to look at the catchment as well of workforces and supply chains for airports, which can be far and wide. And there have been some really interesting programs with schools to educate children on the types of employment opportunities there are. So I guess if I start on the jobs and employment side, there's an awful lot that can be done. And in a sense, if you look at an airport greenfield development as a development, there are all types of opportunities that flow from that in addition to the aviation ones.
So Daniel, as an investor, clearly that would align with your values quite closely. I would have thought the idea of engaging with local communities and doing better for them. But that requires a pretty close partnership with those that are developing the airports. Is that something that you're seeing as something which is developing and which is a growing understanding that the benefits to the local community can be encouraged rather than just a sort of an outcome?
No, definitely. I think in many studies, the overall macroeconomic effects and benefits that aviation and much more specifically airports bring for regional development has been proven. I mean, that's not only in Zurich, that is in the major metros as well. There is this rule of thumb that for each million passenger, there will be a creation of 1,000 jobs. So, and I think this is continuing despite the fact that as airports as well, you look at digitalization, and that definitely has a reduction of manpower as one of the objectives. But nevertheless, as Joanna said before, there is a whole broad range of activities that airports offer, and the larger ecosystem, the suppliers, delivery of food, if the food sourcing, for example, can be done locally, if certain products can be sourced from local producers, which we, for example, did quite extensively in our airport in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. So we included local products there. That I think that the benefit is very clear on the social part. We are not talking about the environmental aspects. I'll probably talk a bit about that later. But the social part, it is an important ecosystem, and it can be developed and is important for us.
But presumably that's having sort of a degree of planning around that and of purpose is quite important, rather than because it to actually take advantage rather than just assume that it'll happen as a matter of course. It would be a good thing. So Joanna, I know that you've worked specifically on some of the Heathrow economic development work in the UK. And perhaps the Heathrow is quite a large, unusual airport, and the scale of the development that was being planned there is probably quite unusual. But how do you, with so much of the Greenfield airport pipeline being quite a lot smaller than the expansion that's planned at Heathrow, and probably also different sort of economies as well? How do you think that's applicable? Is it applicable, or is it quite a different problem?
No, I think it's applicable, because the smart thing that happened when we were looking at that economic strategy was a really strong sense of partnership. So the local authorities and the Heathrow and a whole other bunch of like regional and governance and leaders, so business leaders, government and local authorities formed a really strong partnership to ensure that all the change that was going to be brought to the area had long-term and enduring benefits, and that they were easily described. Because I think sometimes the problem or the buffer that you come up against is how to describe those benefits. So as Daniel said, there's a whole raft of ways that you can demonstrate benefits on development. He just said a million passengers creates 100,000 jobs, and that kind of message. I think the trick as well is to be able to tell the story really locally with any type of development or any type of, whether it's airport or other big expansion infrastructure. I think local people generally want to know what's in it for them, because it's happening in their place, so much as the fact that this is obviously a global industry. So we worked really hard to communicate and work with local partners, and I kind of use the word partnership really sort of boldly, if you like, because it was the way in which we achieved a really strong story and sense of what would happen in the area. And as I say, it's predicated on jobs, employment, wider skills chains, supply chains and so forth. There are other airports that I've worked with in the UK and Europe who look wider than that and want to think about housing affordability and kind of interesting opportunities to deliver better quality of life, landscaped environments and so forth. So they think about it as a whole place proposition. But I guess to finish on that comment, it was absolutely about partnership, open communication and telling the story for local people as much as obviously the international benefits as well.
Thanks for that. So, I mean, Daniel, you're as a company, obviously you're based in Europe, and one of the observations I have of having been based in Asia for a long time and then now back to Europe is that the needs are very different in terms of sustainable aviation development in Asia compared to sort of Western Europe, say, for instance. And therefore, some of the messaging that comes from the more mature markets is much more focused on sort of decarbonisation and zero carbon, and development being a bad thing in inverted commas, and sort of flight shaming. And clearly, that's not a that's not a thing that's going to work for many of the developing economies in Asia and other parts of the world. So, how do you think we can make the messaging more relevant to the Asia context, where it's perhaps a more nuanced view of sustainable development that's needed?
Yeah, this is a general challenge for, let's say, development aims that might be different in different parts of the world. We look at it from different perspectives. On one side, you can make a business out of it. Sustainability measures do not necessarily mean higher costs, but let's take a simple example of what we have planned for Noida is the question of electric energy. So by tying up with photovoltaic providers, by solar farms on the airport, and with the current prices of solar energy in India, which is at par or at times even below the traditional energy on the grid, it's a good business case in the end. So I think apart from the obligations and our commitments, we look at it as an opportunity. The same with infrastructure for electric vehicles. We are quite convinced that this can be an interesting proposition for smaller businesses providing transportation means based on electricity. So I think we have to stress this fact as well when we look at the pure sustainability part. On the society part, obviously back to the employment opportunity and the upskilling that is required and that we can provide for people that live in the environment there. I think that's an important element. I think the key message there for what we are trying to bring is we should, as an industry, as airports, not try to reduce or ban travel. That's not what is required, but what we have to do is try to eliminate or reduce the effects that travel bring, and to make this sustainable. But I guess we'll talk about this later as well. I think that's an important part.
Thanks, Daniel. So I just want to move on now. So to maybe think about some of the ways that we can, as professionals in this industry, best influence positive outcomes for Greenfield airports. So turning to you, Joanna, first, various sort of stakeholders, whether that be government, developers, investors, airlines, consultants, have different incentives for being part of the development of a Greenfield airport and of achieving sustainable development outcomes. Is there any common ground for partnerships and understanding how to work better together at earlier stages in the project, do you think?
As I said before, it sounds so basic, but it's all about communication and having common goals and working on the right outcomes for each partner. I heard someone speak about this once, and they said something that I just thought was so reasonable and straight. They said, when you're working between the public and the private sector and an investor, it's fine. Public sector are there as the custodians for public good or public money or public expense, and the private sector is there in a free market economy to make commercial ends, and that's fine. You just need to both be at the table, understanding each other's goals and each other's outcomes, and then you can come to some really sensible and clear partnership opportunities. And I think that's a really smart thing I heard. It's the first time I've heard someone kind of say, let's just put this on the table. People are working for different means, but generally, if you're all aimed towards the same outcomes, which, as we're discussing here, which is social and economic and sustainable outcomes, then there's definitely a lot that can be achieved by working in partnership. And in regards to incentives, I guess they are all local, depending on the area or the context, the region that you're working in. But again, good negotiation and good understanding of incentives, it all goes back to communications again, I guess, is where I'd land that answer. And I think, as we said, and I'm going to repeat myself, having seen some really interesting airport development over the last number of years, it's where there's been the opportunity to do more and do better. So whether it's around active travel and different opportunities to introduce sustainable options to travel to the airport and back, or develop corridors and opportunities for growth and expansion of jobs which might not be airport direct jobs but related to airport and want access to that international gateway and so forth, is where I think it's sort of the master plan, if you like, of coming together and demonstrating the outcomes for everybody involved. So I would suggest that whatever region you're in, if you can come to a good conclusion and make sense of what you want to do together, then the better you are together, if you like.
Daniel, do you want to add to that? Because I suspect I mean, I'm sure you see it from a slightly different perspective. So I'd be interested to hear your sort of view of how that might be practical or not, or how that might be encouraged.
Yes, definitely. So I would fully agree with the statement that you heard or that you're referring to, Joanna. I mean, we are here to do business. I mean, obviously, and we do this within the framework of the public entity, whoever it is in the country. Has set out what are the parameters, what are the service levels, what are the norms to be applied with. And obviously, it is in our benefit then also to bring in innovations that could be in the area of ESG, but that could also be in the area of technology to make it more viable as a project and to grow it. Obviously, growth. And that is, I think, one of the big topics that is everywhere around. Growth has got negative aspects with it. And I think inherently in the industry, we are here to provide infrastructure. We are here to provide additional capacity for growth. So let's see as an industry how we can manage this growth and limit the negative effects of growth.
Thanks, Daniel. I know you've mentioned Noida a couple of times, and you mentioned specifically the work on energy and electric vehicles. Can you give us a couple of other examples, possible, if you've got where you've perhaps been able to influence positive sort of sustainable development outcomes in the planning or design process? So
yes, definitely in the planning of buildings, whatever, could be terminals, but could be other buildings at the airports. We usually follow certain standards. So these LEED standards, that's one of them, globally applied, forces us then in many ways, be it water consumption, be it energy, be it heating, be it cooling, to really apply the best and latest technology. So this has been done and is being done in Zurich, but we apply the same principles now in India. There we focus on nearly 3 or 4 aspects. So I mentioned the energy. So energy is the key there, especially in Noida, where you have temperatures going down to 0 and in summer 40. So heating, cooling is a big issue. Storage obviously is one of the key challenges there. The second one would be, what do we do with our waste? The whole waste cycle is an important part, and we are looking at working together with the local communities to set up waste to energy or waste to liquid plants there to actually use this waste that is being produced on a daily basis. And the last one, not less important, is the whole water cycle, be it drinking water, capturing rainwater, 80% of it, treating it and then using it, but also the wastewater. In many countries, sewage treatment plants are not yet standard, but this is a mandatory element on the airport for all the concessionaires, that the effluents will all be treated before we let them go outside the airport perimeter. So I think these are key activities that we will be focusing on. And I think we can do it at an early stage in the planning, by the choice of materials, by the flow of air in the building, inside, outside. I think that's the advantage for the Greenfield airport, whereas in brownfields, you're always a bit limited.
So so sort of moving on to the third question then, really on opportunities and barriers perhaps to some of those opportunities. Daniel, clearly private investment has and will continue to play a key role in delivering this pipeline of greenfield airports in the region. And as investors, how do you see some of the key risks, barriers, and opportunities for sustainability? Not perhaps in terms of from your perspective, but understanding that if the end goal is to have a more sustainable development that's more inclusive and offers more opportunities for communities, including perhaps whether there's in places whether there's policy vacuums. I mean, I think that different countries have different stages of development in their policies. But do you have any view on how that can be on those risks, barriers, and opportunities?
Yeah, as you rightly said, I think we'll have to have two different hats. One hat is as an investor. There you focus on different things than when you look at it from a let's say from a public policy point of view. So if we as an industry want to advance and sort of unlock possible blockades, then I think what I mentioned earlier, sustainability criteria would need to be included in the early stage of development, be it the choice of developers, be it the through financing agreements, be it also through the choice of materials. We don't really see that too often. There are service level requirements, there are financial requirements in these bids with regards to the financial strength of the bidders. Sometimes you need to show that you have an ISO environmental certificate, but it's not so much then linked to what you're actually going to deliver as a developer. So I think if that were to be included, I guess it would also change a bit the type of bidding that would be there. But again, that is a matter of policy goals. Joanna mentioned that before, that the policy goals might be different of the public entity. In the case of private investments, it's also different, and that they are not yet aligned. I think there we have areas for improvement.
Thanks for that. I mean, although we're not really today addressing the sort of environmental and ecological impacts and aspects of airport development, because I think that's been pretty much addressed in other sessions. It's too good an opportunity to miss to ask you, in your view, do you think that, and without being specific about airport projects you're involved in, perhaps, are you seeing places where opportunities being overlooked or lost in airport developments that could have made a difference without derailing the project, and that would have made it more acceptable to the public, made it more sustainable, given a better outcome? Have you seen sort of examples or mistakes that get repeated time and time again, or do you think it's a very particular to a particular opportunity?
I mean, a couple of things come to my mind. I mean, the first one is probably the site selection. That is usually a controversial part, whereas in some countries, the site chosen could be in sensitive areas. The access to that specific site is only possible through, let's say, highways, and there is no provisions for public transport. So I think all these aspects, I think, would be important elements to consider at an early stage. the second element might be, and that is something we see in various countries, is that there is a lack of overarching policies on the number of airports and the overall location. So it's always attractive for smaller areas in a country to have an airport, maybe even an international airport. But whether that is required from a demand perspective, that's a different point. I think these are opportunities to optimize infrastructure. In general, in Asia, I think we still talk about a lack of infrastructure for airports. That's also why there are a lot of projects, because there is more and more people traveling, and there is more and more people that can afford to travel. Now, obviously, everything said was related to pre-COVID levels. Now it's a bit different, but this will come back. I think these are key points. A third element maybe also is that when I look at financing and also the compensation for investments, which usually translate into passenger fees, do not necessarily take into account investments in sustainability technologies or provision of socio-demographic or social positive impacts that could be included in these economic frameworks. I think that could be an incentive, and that could be strengthened in some of these concessions.
So that's really interesting, because I was to take a couple of things away from there. I think it is that, sometimes by the time the investors are involved, a lot of the die is cast, and so actually with site selection and accessibility and all of those and policy frameworks, a lot of that's done before investors actually have your part to play. So it seems to me what you're saying there is that perhaps in some places there's a need for more of that, more sort of of planning for sustainable outcomes, and that enables you then to deliver a good result when the investment actually comes to fruition. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's an important element. I mean, typically, unless it's let's say an unsolicited proposal, we see that, for example, in the Philippines, where you have as an investor possibility to propose a project to the government, but that's not a common model in other places. And there you are involved right from the beginning. You have to prove the financeability, the viability of the project. Others, you come at a later stage where everything is already done. So there the influence is limited.
Yeah, okay. I suppose the other side of that is that if it becomes the free market is all, then that is sort of counter to the it's just almost a first come first served, rather than a well thought out plan of where the infrastructure should be and how it should be developed from those principles, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly.
So Joanna, just moving back to you for a moment. So understanding the complexity. It's important, but it's also a factor of life, not only in terms of impacts, but ensuring that an airport does what it's meant to do, whether that be part of a multi-airport system or affordable to users or whatever. The reality for airports in Asia is that often they don't have enough time or money or perhaps experience of developing this sort of infrastructure to engage with that sort of detail at an early stage. Do you think there's anything that can be done sort of affordably to help bridge that gap? It really comes back to the same thing of the die being cast by the time the international investors at least come along to invest their money in delivering the infrastructure.
Yeah, I guess I'm reflecting on Daniel's points there, where he was noting a strong framework and a good understanding of the service level agreements and the way in which the airport can develop. I think that airports and development and infrastructure is complex. So complexity was a good word to use there. I think that I'm not sure I can answer the question about affordability, but I think a lot of the conversation that we've had today is about making sure there is good access and good infrastructure that services the airport. So I guess my comment there, again, agreeing with Daniel's points about, you know, sustainable modes of transport and making sure that the right location has the right access, is I would suggest that the plan needs to be wide and needs to be able to demonstrate, you know, benefits for both people, place, and obviously aviation. So I guess you know, when I was talking to you about this event, we were sort of saying that yes, it's about airport development, but it's also about place development. I mean, any kind of development, I think, is about place development, because we're serving people in whatever sense it might be, whether it's to travel or employment and so forth. So I think complexity is a really good word and a good term to look at when you're thinking about this kind of complex process. But I think, as Daniel said, it's all about having a really strong framework. So I guess lessons learned from good airports and good development and those that are achieving good sustainable outcomes is, I bet if you looked, they've got a really clear and strong framework and a pathway to how they want to deliver their aims and their goals, whether it's social, environmental, sustainable, and so forth. Yeah.
So Daniel, you know, I think we've had quite a good conversation so far, but I think clearly we've only scratched the surface of the sustainability conversation in our conversation today. So yeah, we're now we're sitting here in the ACI community, and what role do you think the ACI community can play to help bring this all together and to promote more sustainable outcomes for all the parties, whether it be government, communities, investors, passengers, over the long term? Do you have any views on how ACI can the ACI community rather than the ACI specifically can sort of help address that?
Well, I would say ACI has done a good sterling job in promoting different type of schemes and certificates. I think like not a lot of other industries, the carbon accreditation program has been highly successful. is an excellent program. I think there's always additional room, and I would like to come back to part of the discussions we had earlier. When I see now, even during COVID discussions, and you mentioned flight shaming, and that people start thinking about, should I fly, should I not fly? We feel as operator, and obviously there is a certain bias there, but I think for ACI it's important to focus and to show that this is not solving the problem, because mankind has been traveling for the last 5,000, 10,000 years. Our trade systems are based on exchange of goods and people. So this will and has to continue. But what we can do as an industry, not only airports, but together with our airline partners, are, for example, making sure that any kind of taxation that comes up in future, CO2 taxation, is being used to reduce the impacts of flying, for example, in producing sustainable aviation fuels, and not being misused in other policy areas. So I think this message is important, and that we bring together not only the airport community, but the airlines, but air navigation service provision, for joint action plans to mitigate the environmentally harming aspects of travel. And I think there are still programs, a lot has been done, but I think that would be what we would expect also from ACI as an umbrella organization of airports.
Thank you. I suppose it's we're entering a very interesting time, because post pandemic, as growth almost certainly will come back, and passenger numbers will come back over however many years it takes. The sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room is still the carbon, the sustainable development agenda, and sort of a general question to you both: do you see that being sort of something which will be a shock change to the industry, or something which will be an evolution, or what? Because clearly, the big challenge for aviation is carbon and its percentage, if in a growing carbon share, and we've talked about the positive sides of aviation and the positive benefits. Do you see there having to be sort of a shock change to the industry, or will it be a sort of a gentle or a fast evolution?
I definitely see it as an evolution, and I think, as I mentioned, there are different roles to play. So airports, we have to make sure that whatever we can do to limit emissions on our side is being done. We, for example, in Noida International Airport, we have made a clear decision that we will only accept the electric vehicles on the air side. So this is something that we can influence. We can do the planning so that we, in 10 years' time, are able to store and to distribute hydrogen as a fuel. Airbus is doing a lot of projects there, and I'm convinced this will be around, and we need to be prepared and not at the stage when it's then marketable say, okay, now sorry, we can't do, we haven't really thought about this. So that is important. And the evolution also on the airline side there, it's not only an external pressure, but it's also an inherent interest of the airline industry and the engine producers to reduce costs of operating aircrafts, and it's definitely cheaper to operate with hydrogen in the end once this is marketable and it's processed and the storage is resolved. So I think we are moving towards the right direction. We have, as an industry, we have to do everything that's possible to reduce the carbon footprint. I think that is clear.
Joanna, do you have any views on that sort of context?
Yeah, I agree with Daniel. It will be an evolution, but hopefully a really fast one. And we've used the word in this conversation, innovation, and it will be innovation that starts to solve this complex problem. As Daniel said, nobody is denying that we need a step change. And as we come out of the pandemic, we know that I think the two big agenda items that the globe will be talking about is human health and the environment. And so, as we've noted, there are ways in which it can be mitigated in the immediacy with taxation and incentives and a different structure perhaps, but equally, as Daniel said, we need to evolve and people have a propensity to travel. So it's how we address that. And I think innovation and new technologies and opportunities for travel will continue, but there needs to be, how do you do a quick evolution? But rapid change needed, but obviously it will take some time for these things to play out, but nobody's denying that said there needs to be some change. Yep.
Okay, so before I sort of wrap up, I just want to give either of you, so maybe Daniel, if I come back to you first, is there anything that you feel that we haven't covered that perhaps we should have done in terms of this sort of nuanced, broader sustainable development challenge? This is an opportunity really for you to express something that we can discuss.
Maybe we haven't. I mean, we covered many things, but what we haven't really talked about also is the issue of access to airports. And I think a lot of cooperation between the airport, be it municipal, be it private, to make sure that passengers are able to arrive and depart from airports on sustainable ways of transportation. So I think that is something which, especially for Greenfield airports, for countries with less integrated or intense public transport, this is something important. I think there we should also put some of the industry efforts to distribute best practices, to look at innovative ways of doing this. It doesn't necessarily have to be a train in any case, but I think there are different technologies available today.
So I guess that would very much fall within the sort of the remit of governments and regional governments to enable that, if not to deliver it themselves, but to build that into part of the planning process for the infrastructure. Joanna, have you anything that you think that we've missed that's important from your learnings of working at airports
Yeah, I guess, well, we didn't touch too much on airport experience and how we can achieve kind of sustainable goals through, design and landscape. And as Daniel said, access to the airport. I think infrastructure is a really important topic, and innovation in digital, actually. We didn't go too far into that, but there have been some really interesting and compelling examples of open data and access to open data to analyse different issues and opportunities in airports, whether it be, as Daniel said, waste, energy systems, use of the airport, movement, and so forth. So I think as we move forward, it'll be really interesting to see what the industry does next with that kind of access to data and analytics that we haven't seen previously. And the world is moving fast in terms of digital, so I'm excited to see what comes next in the industry in regards to using data and digital technologies to understand how we can develop more sustainable outcomes. And as Daniel said, active travel, transport networks and infrastructure is definitely something that is not got time to explore it now, but something that's an interesting topic as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think I feel that I can't summarise sort of in great detail, but it does seem to me that there are a few themes that come out of there. I mean, clearly, complexity was a word that I think was quite an appropriate word. This is a very complex problem with lots of nuances and lots of different sort of angles and interests from different stakeholders. But I think the underpinning a lot of what both of you were saying was the benefit of sort of partnership and collaboration and early planning and coming together to try and shape sort of common goals and to then try and work out rather a planned progression from all the way from, as Daniel said, from site selection and what that means for access to and presumably ecology and environmental impacts on the one hand, all the way through to how things are financed, how the procurement is shaped, and how the conditions under which delivery is enabled are shaped. All of that is important, and each of us has a part to play in shaping that to an effective outcome. Is there anything that you feel that ought to be added to that, Daniel, as a final comment from you?
No, thanks. So I just want to reiterate that we as an airport operator are committed. We are committed to the UN Nations Global Compact guidelines. We want to apply that to our airports, and we will have a close dialogue with lenders also on what we do, what we can do, and that doesn't only include environmental aspect, that includes social aspects, working conditions in the end. And I think having clean and transparent governance in the dealing with these concessions, I think that's important as a company for our future also.
Okay, Joanna, have you anything that you want to add to that?
I think my final point would be we need to make sure we keep monitoring and evaluating and pushing the agenda. When we set these frameworks and targets, it's all about making sure that we meet them and that there is a good system in which people can report on the good work they're doing, so much as the issues that we've just started to touch on at the end of the conversation there. But complexity is the word, as you said.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much to you both. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure that it will kick off lots of conversations. So with that, I'm going to hand back to our moderator and chair and say thank you very much to the both of you, and I look forward to seeing you both in person soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for both of you.
Thank you, Ian, and our panelists for your very interesting perspective shared. As the panelists pointed out, ACI and the collective ACI community needs to continue coming together to address the important issues surrounding sustainability. Now we'll stay online in the chat box for a few more minutes in case anyone has any comments or burning questions. If you have colleagues who wanted to join today but couldn't, do let them know that the playback video will be available on our YouTube channel soon. Join us again next week, same time, same place, on Tuesday, 15th of June, for our 7th session. One of our newer World Business partners, Marsh, will lead in a conversation on how post-COVID digitalization changed the risk profile of airports. Over the course of our @ACI APAC online event, we've heard how the pandemic has really pushed forward and even expedited our use of technology, increasing our digital footprint along the passenger journey. So this session with Marsh will be very timely for airport leaders' consideration. If you have any questions in between, please do feel free to reach out to us via email, Twitter, or LinkedIn.
See you next week.